Hi, my name is Jess Richter. I am an artist based out of Regina, Saskatchewan, and I am originally from Nokomis, Saskatchewan. My practice involves exploring German Canadian culture and heritage, and today I'm going to share with you some of that through the German Canadian art form of Fraktur, which is a kind of folk art calligraphy. Today you're going to learn how to make your own, what kind of motifs are popular, how to personalize it, and how to modernize it a little bit. So first, I would love to just tell you a little bit about why I love folk art. Folk art is really, really great because it's by ordinary people for ordinary people. It's about taking everyday materials, kind of what you have on hand, and transforming everyday objects into something special. You don't need to be a professional artist to do it. You don't need to have a ton of knowledge to do it. All you need to have is some creativity and a little bit of inventiveness. And that's kind of where all of the best folk art comes from. So examples of folk art that you might be familiar with are paper cutting, beadwork, different kinds of pattern painting. So if you think maybe if you are of Ukrainian heritage, like many folks in Saskatchewan are, a lot of those beautiful embroideries and patterns are also examples of folk art. And the great thing about folk art is that it changes with the people. That's my cat meowing. Thanks, Louise. It changes with the people it comes to Canada with. And it changes with the people who are using it now. So if you think of First Nations beading, there's all kinds of really fantastic artists that are changing beading and modernizing it. When you think about Ukrainian embroidery, there's lots of fantastic artists that are also changing and modernizing it. So I love folk art because it's for everyone and anyone can do it because we all have connections to folk art. Let's talk a little bit about what German Fraktur art is, German Canadian Fraktur art. Hi, Louise. So nice of you to join us today. So German Canadian Fraktur art came over with German Mennonite immigrants in the 1700s and 1800s. It's not very common in Saskatchewan, but it is very common in southern Ontario, as well as in Pennsylvania Dutch regions of the United States. So it's practiced by both men and women, and it started out as a way to decorate everyday objects, particularly birth certificates, book panels. Anything that needed to be special was often decorated in this art style. The name Fraktur comes from the old kind of calligraphy that we see in a lot of German and Swiss and other kind of European writing. It comes from that. And initially, when Fraktur was started as sort of an art form in North America, it was meant to just decorate and embellish the calligraphy. But over time, the designs became just as important. So magically, you should be seeing somewhere around this time some examples of Fraktur art from the University of Waterloo archives. They have one of the largest collections of Fraktur artwork. There's only about 500 pieces of Fraktur that have survived because one of the only problems with folk art is because it's made by ordinary everyday people. A lot of the time it's just not kept or it's thrown out because it's not seen as special. So it can be really hard to find objects that are from folk artists. And I'm sure, many of you can think of like items or pieces of art made by grandparents or great grandparents that maybe you wish you still had, but were maybe gotten rid of. So, hi. Are you being helpful today? I knew it. So, in Fraktur, there's lots and lots of common motifs, and you'll see this in folk art across the world. So, common motifs and symbols that you'll see in Fraktur are hearts, and I'm sure many of you can think of that. If you've played the game Dutch Blitz, you'll be seeing a lot of Fraktur motifs. So lots of hearts, birds, long vined plants, lots of very sharp leaves as well. And a lot of the colors that are used are really reflective of what was available at the time, or maybe what pigments have survived. So, you know, it's really hard. I don't think I've seen a lot of blue necessarily, but there's lots of red and yellow and green. Those seem to be some of the most common colors, as well as black. So that kind of reflects what was available at the time. So Fraktur, it kind of fell out of popularity around the late 1800s, kind of when people started to go into more urban centers. Assimilation became more important, but also World War I was happening, would be happening about 20 years later from then. And of course, a lot of German Canadian folk culture was lost during World War I and World War II due to anti-German sentiments. So by exploring this with me today, you are helping preserve German Canadian culture, and I'm very excited that you could do that with me. So now that we know a little bit about Fraktur, we kind of understand what it looks like, we are going to start on our own lovely Fraktur journey today. So I'm going to show you an example of a piece that I've done, and then I'm going to kind of walk you through the steps of how I do it, and all of the different ways of thinking about it that you can have, as well as the materials that I use, which are very boring and pretty inexpensive, because that's the joy of folk art, right? You don't need a ton of money, you don't need a ton of supplies to do it. When I was thinking about how I kind of wanted to think about Fraktur and help you all learn about it, one of the things I wanted to focus on was family. So this is my grandma Stockdale's name, Nancy, and I chose traditional Fraktur patterns to kind of make a little tribute to her. She passed away a couple of years ago. So I chose a lot of really traditional elements. So you'll see here that I've used a heart, a lot of long vines, as well as sharp spiky leaves. And one of the things I love about Fraktur is that you think it's going to be very soft and feminine all the time, and it's not. A lot of the plants that are used in it are very spiky and almost tropical. A lot of the topics used within Fraktur, you know, as it evolved away from merely being just decorative for birth certificates, a lot of biblical scenes were done as well, such as Adam and Eve or animals in the jungle. So you can see all of these really interesting interpretations of people's world and their perceptions through Fraktur. And so that's what we're going to try to do as we re-explore Fraktur today. So what I've done to kind of modernize my Fraktur is I've used slightly different paint than is traditional. I've kept it a little bit more contemporary. I've used some orange paper. And I've also, mine isn't particularly, doesn't have a lot of religious imagery in it, which a lot of Fraktur work does. So if you are interested in exploring that, I think you should. So I'm going to plop this down, and we are going to get started on what materials you will need. Thank you, Louise. You're so helpful for me. So the materials that we will be using today are pretty simple, and really what I would love for you to do is use whatever you have around the house. If you have some old watercolors, those are fantastic. That is what Fraktur art traditionally used, was watercolors. Oil paints, you know, they're not going to work to put on a birth certificate paper. You had to use what was going to work with the paper. So you can really use whatever paint you like, as long as it can go on paper. So personally, I like using gouache a lot. I use a pretty specific kind. It is by Holbein, but you don't have to buy that, of course. This is just my great love. So this stuff is a little bit different than your typical gouache. It is a mix between acrylic and gouache, and that is why I love it. It kind of dries into a plastic the way acrylic does, but it's nice and opaque the way gouache is. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, and it's not going to smudge too much if you paint over it, and you can also use it on a variety of different surfaces, which we'll kind of talk about in a little bit. So these are the colors I use most often. As you can see, I already kind of do use a lot of Fraktur colors, to be really honest with you. That's just my color palette. I also don't like mixing colors at all. So if you love to mix colors, full steam ahead. But for me, I hate mixing colors. I think it's boring. So I just use it straight from the tube. It also saves a lot of time to do that. I also just have a little china plate that I use as a little palette. Again, because I don't mix my colors, I don't have to worry too much. If you do like mixing colors, honestly, an ice cream pail lid is great. That was what my first art teacher taught me to use, and honestly, it's all reliable. Also egg cartons, so you can keep it cheap as well. So brushes are always an important thing to consider, and this is where I don't cheap out on typically, but again, use what you have. So for Fraktur work, I tend to use really small sizes. So I have a size 0 here. Here's a size 3. So this is probably as large as I go in a lot of ways. So I'll use that to do hearts or larger areas of solid color. And of course, here's just a little too. So really a lot of them very small, and I like just having a square one around just in case. So those are the basic brush sizes that I really use the most for Fraktur. To get a lot of that detail in, I like using a pointed tip brush, because then you can get those long sinewy lines that we saw in the examples of Fraktur. And of course, just a standard pencil and eraser to get your lines down. So the first thing you're going to do is, when you do your Fraktur, is my rule of thumb is always start with a good pencil drawing. So I'll show you one that I've started, and then I'm going to walk you through making your own, because it's really helpful to see how someone approaches it. One of the things I love about Fraktur is that it's both symmetrical and it's both not symmetrical. So in this pencil sketch that I've done here, and you can see I've modernized it just a little bit, I've kept things very, very, very symmetrical. It's not quite squared up on the page, but I've got my hearts, I've got some dots that I've added in. Everything has its complementary partner. And you'll also notice I have those characteristic spiked leaves. Another motif, very common in Fraktur, are almost kind of wagon wheel shapes. I'm not particularly sure what they symbolize, but I love them. They're also often turned into star shapes. You can also find these imagery in Dutch Mennonite witch barn marks. So like big circles on barns, they're meant to protect barns. So they may be protection symbols. And again, I've worked to really modernize it just a little bit by including some eyes in here. So if you're nervous about drawing, I have great news. You don't really need to know how to draw that well to do this. If you can draw some basic shapes, you're set. So let's kind of run through how we can start our Fraktur image. Okay, and again, any paper will do, just whatever you've got handy. If it's computer paper, that's great. I would just say make sure it's unlined as much as you can. Lines can be helpful to find your place, but one of the lovely things I love about Fraktur is it always looks handmade. So we're not going for perfection here. We are going for human, which is kind of nice, isn't it? So don't worry if you make a mistake, that's fine. It's all part of Fraktur. So I'll start with just a basic pencil, and I try to start semi in the middle. And again, with Fraktur, a lot of the time things kind of drift from side to side. And with the old pieces we're looking at, we might not even be looking at the full page. We're just looking at a chunk of it. So, but I like to start in the middle. So I'm going to start with a traditional motif, which is a heart. And I love starting with a big heart because it's symmetrical and it's easy to center yourself with it. So you can see I'm not being too fussy, just getting this down, because the joy is I can just erase any lines I don't want. So I've kind of centered this now. And what I really want to do is kind of bring in some more of those traditional motifs. So what I'm next going to try for, I'm going to place some birds at the bottom of this. So we're not looking for realistic birds. We're looking for stylized birds. And part of folk art is that most things are stylized, right? You know, back in ye old days in England, you know, being able to draw realistically was a skill for the upper class. This is good peasant work, and as a good peasant, I do love it. So I'm just using kind of a strange shape for my bird. So you see I've kind of built up a head there, gone down into the belly, and come to the tip there. And I'm going to do the same thing here. Are they going to be exactly symmetrical? No, because I'm not a robot, and that's okay. If I was a robot, I would have other problems to worry about. What side you start on doesn't matter. You should just do whatever you're most comfortable with. I'm left-handed, so I find it always easier to start on the left-hand side of things. You might feel different. So the next thing you do, we've got our basic bird shapes. Now we're gonna go for some glamour. And I'm sure you saw in a lot of those examples, kind of almost like birds of paradise were really common. You're not gonna see any of those birds flying around Southern Ontario for the most part. So again, we're going to lean into our folk art selves, and we're going to be a little bit more imaginative. So I'm going to give my bird a long, massive tail, which is kind of a bit of a upside down fan shape. And I'm going to bring in some of those lovely round shapes that we saw. So just a little bit of scallop, and then I'm going to connect them at the bottom. And we have very easily made some wings. So I'm running off the paper a little bit, and again, that's okay. It's Fraktur, it doesn't need to be perfect. And I'm going to, as usual, go over this way. So I find one of the easiest things to do is when you draw an element on one thing, don't bother finishing it, always draw it on the other side. So I start with one shape, one shape, one shape, one shape. That way you're not overwhelming yourself and your brain is working a little bit less. So I'm gonna do my little beaks next, just a little triangle, nothing too fancy, and some little eyes. So again, I'm just carefully repeating my shapes, and I'm going to draw kind of a blobby shape on their heads. They're almost like peacocks, really, which I'm very into. And wings. Wings are just a little bit of a teardrop shape. So if you look at a lot of Fraktur work, there's kind of standards for how it's done, and I'm sort of sticking to those a little bit right now. When you're working with folk art as a contemporary artist, or just for yourself, it's good to stick to the things that make it identifiable as being part of a folk art movement. So in this case, our heart and our fancy birds, they're giving us that. But what I'd love for us to do next is to consider how you and I can make it into our own. So what I'd love for you to do now is think about a plant that has personal meaning for you. Perhaps it is a tiger lily. Maybe it's a lilac. Maybe it's canola, honestly. Think about what plant has personal meaning for you, and I'd love for you to incorporate it into your drawing in a very simple folkloric way. And so the way you're going to do that is just think about the shapes that it's in and break it down. If you're working with canola, break it down into those shapes, and you're probably going to want a yellow to work with that. It doesn't have to look exactly the way it is because we're not doing botanical drawings. We're doing Fraktur. So the plant I'm choosing is going to be wheat because my family is a farming family. So this is not going to look like the wheat you're going to see in the fields. Any self-respecting farmer would look at my wheat and judge it a little bit, and I would not be mad at them about it. But the important thing is that it adds to the overall symmetry and design. So your plants should do something similar. I'm tucking mine in, and I'm letting it kind of follow the shape of the heart. So you'll see I've really let this big heart shape I've made in the middle, I've let it guide every single decision I've made. And then I'll add my wheat. There. You will not find, for the most part, wheat in Fraktur. I am making it into this time and place. So now we've got this beautiful start with our pencil drawing. The next thing we need to do is assess. Is it balanced? Do we need more in it? And frankly, I feel like it's a little bit plain. So I'm going to get rid of some of my heart lines. And what I'd like to do is bring in some of those great spiky plants that you've heard me talk about multiple times. So what I love about Fraktur is that you can really just draw a line anywhere and add to it. In some of the examples I showed you, you'll see that drawing a line and then adding spiked flowers to it is very common. It's almost a shortcut to adding detail. And let's say you are an old-timey Fraktur drawer and you've got about 50 million birth certificates to get through, and you're going to take what shortcuts you can take. All right, and then I am going to add a little heart up at top, just a couple of dots. Honestly, never underestimate the power of dots to just even things out. Already it's more filled out and looking better. And I'm going to add kind of some starred wagon wheels in the corners, which I had mentioned before. If you want it to be perfect, you can of course trace something, but this is Fraktur, we're not going for perfect. And again, I'm not 100% sure what these symbolize, but my best guess is protection. So I'm going to almost make them like flowers. Again, it's okay if it's uneven. This is folk art, it doesn't have to be perfect. All right, so this is looking pretty balanced to me. So our next step is going to be, we're going to add some color. And this is of course one of the greatest parts and almost everyone's favorite. Okay, so our next step is we need to add color to this. And as I mentioned before, I will not be mixing any color. So if you're gonna be mixing your color, you may want to pause it. So what I particularly love doing when working with Fraktur is not overwhelming my brain or the viewer's eye with too much color. We're not painting a landscape here, we are painting a pattern. So if you look at this piece that I did, I've only got 3 colors and that's it. All I did was make sure that my colors were balanced. That my black, there wasn't too much black, there wasn't too much of one color. I've just used a copper, a very light blue, and a black. So I'm going to be sticking with just a couple of, maybe 3 colors. And I'd advise, giving it a go. Part of this is challenging yourself and seeing what you can do with it. So the colors I'm going to choose, I'm gonna go for this copper, kind of a minty green. No, not yellow, that's gross. I'm gonna go for very dark green. Yeah, so minty green, copper, yeah, perfect. When you're choosing your colors, try to pick a nice balance. Always try to have one dark color, one light color, and one kind of mid-toned color, so you can keep a good visual balance with your piece. So again, taking your brush, and again, pointed tip is always best because then it saves you a lot of work. So what I do is I work with one color at a time, and I just kind of let my paintbrush flow. It's very meditative. If you're the kind of person that really loves coloring books or coloring, this is for you. You will love it. And even if you don't, you're gonna love it anyways. So see, I'm just using long, smooth strokes. Sometimes one is all you need to get it done. Let the tip of the brush do some work for you. Some forms of folk painting, what they'll do is they'll like kind of dab color at the center of it and then just, you know, have a multicolored petal or leaf done in one brush stroke, which is always lovely. That's not what we're doing here with Fraktur though. It's not quite that tradition. Just keep flowing through. So again, with your 3 colors, you're just going to be a little bit careful as you work to make sure that you're not cramming your colors all together. So thinking about the bird, I'm going to make its wings and eyes this dark green, and then I can do something else with the body. So I don't have a bunch of dark green right beside each other. Just very lightly go in and get that in there. Going to do my best to remember that my wheat will not be green, because I feel like that's the thing I may do. And bring in some of that there. So I'm working pretty quickly. You might work a lot more slowly, and that is okay. Okay, good. Managed to get a pattern there. And just keep an eye out and try not to drag your hand across your wet paint, which is a thing we all have done. Okay, so I think we're looking pretty snazzy for a green. So I'm just gonna add a little bit of green to our wagon wheels. So for me, I find it's always easiest to start with your darkest color and then kind of work out from that, because then you kind of have a way to sort of balance it. So you'll see that I've got dark color in each corner and in the center, and that's going to keep things kind of balanced for us. Okay, now get out of there, dark green, and I might come back to you later. So the next thing I'm going to do is consider my wheat, which is going to be copper. Yep. Because I need it to stand out a bit. So whatever pieces of your composition you need to have stand out, make sure that you're picking kind of the color that's going to do that best. If I did these in that light green, it would not work at all. And again, it does not have to be golden wheat because this is Fraktur and we are not concerned about realism. And working very quickly, and just let the brush do the work for you. So I've only used one brush actually thus far, and I can maybe see that not changing. Just quick lines. And let's consider what else we need. So add some copper to our wagon wheels. Again, balance that out. I will confess I'm a little concerned about this heart here because it is rather giant. So I'm just going to outline it in copper, and then I will add in probably that mint green just to lighten things up a bit. So we're modernizing this a little bit. If we're working more traditionally, likely our heart would be red. But thankfully we do not have to do that. And I'm just going to give little copper beats to the birds and add some stripes there. Because I am working quickly and not letting everything fully dry, I'm leaving a little bit of space in between just so my colors don't run together. Fraktur loves some bold color. Okay, so as you can see, I'm sort of planning as I work. So as I go, I'm planning where all my mint color is going to go and how to best incorporate it. The last thing you want is to have a whole bunch of one color right next to each other, because then you're going to lose all of your detail. So you can see my birds are going to have these kind of, whoops daisy. Well, that's for the cat now. She can come in and play with that. So kind of some nice mint color. And I'm letting it be pretty thick so I get a good solid color there. And again, I'm just letting the brush do most of the work for me. Letting it kind of fling out. Not being super concerned about getting everything perfect. If this was your baptismal certificate, then I would try harder. Just kidding. So just zipping along. Oh, I just realized I actually match my drawing. I'm wearing a green shirt and I have like kind of copper painted fingernails. Good for me. That was by accident. Always match your artwork. Lets people know who you are. Lets them know you're coming. Okay, so I'm just going to add a little bit of color there. Boop, boop. All right, so last thing I'm going to be doing is dealing with my heart. And I'm just going to grab a slightly larger brush for that. Usually I don't have this much space to cover. And I'm just going to cover it with one solid color. Again, as is traditional with Fraktur, there's not a lot of pattern covering solid shapes like there might be in other folk traditions. All right, so we've got this, but I am very glad I put that copper outline. All right, so, oh my goodness, I forgot my dots. Let me make those copper. When in doubt, always add more copper is my motto. That's a little bit much up there. Now see, I've made a classic mistake here. I've put way too much copper up in that corner there. It's just Copper City, it doesn't work. So I'm just going to casually go in with a bit of dark green and just cover that up. What is this, amateur hour? Okay, there we go, fixed it. All right, so using just some shapes, 3 colors of paint, and approximately 1 to 2 paintbrushes, you and I have created a glorious example of Fraktur artwork. You can experiment with this art style and make just all kinds of different patterns and shapes in many different ways. The lovely thing about Fraktur as well is it's also meant to decorate everyday objects. So a couple of things I did while I was preparing was I painted a gift bag. Why not? Who would not want to get a thing in this? So yeah, use it to paint some gift bags. And again, copper bear. I just got the copper paint. I'm very excited about it. I've even painted some eggshells with it because why not? I also gold leafed the inside, but that was fun too. So instead of painting standard Easter eggs or doing Ukrainian Easter eggs, do some Fraktur Easter eggs. Just make sure your paint goes with it. Paint bookmarks, paint book plates. If I did not live in a rental house, would my entire house be covered in Fraktur? Yes. It's meant to make everyday objects beautiful, and I hope that you're able to do that as well. So thank you so much, and have a fabulous day, and I hope you enjoyed seeing my cat Louise.